April 19th will forever be a historical day synonymous with some of the United States' deepest and darkest pain. Solidified in history as a day of terrorism, defeat, deception, and hypocritical misconduct in multilateral communication, exactly 32 years ago today, on a property outside of Waco, Texas, federal law enforcement proved their carelessness and incompetence by abusing their complex position to humiliate the reputations of human beings while asserting their lack of motivation to listen to experts from varying academic advisors on and off the scene. For one, once the FBI took over the perimeter from the ATF, educated theologians were advising the FBI that, considering the circumstances, it would be beneficial to getting the residents out of Mount Carmel to listen, examine, and analyze the real meaning of what David Koresh was telling the FBI in regards to his biblical teachings. If the FBI had cared to acknowledge what Koresh was saying, not only could over 70 people still be alive, but perhaps the FBI could have observed that, according to the Judeo-Christian Greek scriptures, the very same 51-day predicament that they had all found themselves in, as well as the methods that were being employed by the FBI, were the very same visions, foresight predictions, and biblical interpretations of certain scriptures that Koresh had been preaching for almost a decade. Protesters, doomsdayers, evangelicals, bootleg journalists, and ordinary Americans all attested to the micro-aggressive approach of the FBI in their obvious attempts to aggravate the Christian sect to come out of their own home, surrender to the establishment that they had actively worked to avoid, admit their amoral inconveniences according to the status quo, and name the United States federal law enforcement as their country's savior. However, underneath all roots of misunderstandings in regard to the 51-day standoff and siege is a systematic functionality, the likes of which has only typically been known to express itself through the various mathematically and philosophically ecliptic models which were devised by pre-scientific ancient civilizations and empires. These models that I speak of are astrological ones, and unanimous to Waco, every single influx of matter produced and made manifest through material instances, i.e. everything currently happening, everything that will happen, and everything throughout the entire history of mankind can be analyzed through an astrological lens and in return is automatically calculated and measured ecliptically. Waco is indeed an isolated incident in an experimental sense. However, ecliptically, this could not be further from the truth. Not only does astrology prove it perfidiously, Waco is entirely isolated from the materialized expressions of astrology's systematic functionalities, as it singularly proves that the sun cannot accidentally move on the ecliptic. And truthfully, if there is any historical resemblance to Pluto's early preparations for travel through Sagittarius, as well as the consistencies in planetary familiarizations, it's what happened outside of Waco, Texas in 1933. The core example to this can be described through the guise of the happenings in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, as well as 9/11, and even instances that occurred prior to February 28, like Ruby Ridge, the World Trade Center bombing, and the raid and siege that was perpetuated by the same organizations that performed during Ruby Ridge, Waco, and the ATF's firebombing and raid on Robert Matthews of the Order, just to name a few. Although this isn't a video about what happened at or as the result of any of these instances, the premise of this discussion is to describe ecliptic relationships that form patterns through the auspices of the Waco predicament in as little technical information as possible. Timothy McVeigh and David Koresh are mutuals in more ways than one. Their astronomical relationship, as well as the relationship to their oddly specific coinciding time on Earth, shows beyond all reasonable doubt that sometimes people are born for us to be a part of their life in some way, shape, or form, and vice versa. The sentinel life forces on the heavens have an extremely good memory and sense of familiarity when it comes to territories they have previously marked. In other words, how could it be possible for a planet, sign, or quadrant to move accidentally when individual cosmological constitutions have produced the necessary resources, people, environment, timing, and consequences throughout specific instances in history that oftentimes produce the necessary rewards, reverberations, or conclusions? Astrology has proven time and time again that nothing happens by accident. Rather, everything occurs in patterns, waves, and unanimous repetitions that exude great attention to detail and memory luminary cycles. Astrological cyclicality aside, McVeigh and Koresh share their age of death as well as the date associated with negative memories that will bind the two forever, April 19. In summary, ecliptic science proves that the incident of Waco and its complex connection to the Oklahoma City bombing displays a prime example of why the saying, history repeats itself, exists. Most students of the clandestine crafts, as well as all types, models, and traditions of mystery thought, crossing through a wide range of ancient or contemporary practices, that the number 33 is of great symbolic importance. Considered a master number in numerology, as well as being assigned of great importance to the crystalline teachings of the esoteric school that implore an inner Christ oil that is crucified at the vagus nerve on the 33rd vertebrae of the spine. Additionally, the number 19 is also considered to be of great importance to the students of astrotheological studies and the mathematicians. One example giving 19 the credential of the 8th prime number, which can only be divided by themselves of the number 1. The 19 kings who ruled Israel before being destroyed by the Assyrians. There are, more importantly, a number of astrological consistencies between the cosmological constitutions of both April 19, 1993 and April 19, 1995, as well as similarities in the planetary constitutions of both of the natal charts of their days of death. Not only do these consistencies auspiciously complement each other, they paradoxically contradict each other, leaving it up to the observer to identify the most pronounced, exaggerated, or insistent trait of each mutual planetary performance. And although at first glance there is no similarities, upon closer inspection, the north node on Waco sits by sign where Oklahoma's moon and Jupiter sit, which in terms of the actualizations or manifestations of consistent material and metaphysical connections between the two instances, the lunar nodes are the main focal point. The most profound of the two is certainly the astrological design of the exact date, time, and place where the Federal Bureau investigation had begun to drive Abrams and Bradley tanks through the walls of Mount Carmel. At exactly 5:55 a.m. on Monday, April 19, 1993, the combat vehicles began punching holes through the plywood walls of Mount Carmel. At this very moment, there was a 4-planet stellium with Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Moon on the ascendant, where Aries, the ram of God, was rising, and where its host, the one who viewed himself as God's ram, would see his untimely end. Jupiter was opposed to 3 of the stellium's planets on the counter-ascendant. The north lunar node was sitting on Sagittarius in the 9th house, and the south on the 3rd in Gemini. Venus was retrograde through Aries, and the ruler of the ascendant was in detriment on the 4th house in Cancer, squared with the insistent Aryan sun. Uranus and Neptune conjunct on the 10th, and Mars on the 4th opposed each other in triplicity, while the Moon and Pluto trined in the 1st and 8th. Together, these intelligent life forces, the ones we call Sidereal, created a kite pattern in the heaven, the heavenly gift of a grand trine with an opposition that encourages the native to further develop the characteristics symbolized by the planet at the top of its form. Uranus and Neptune conjunction in this instance marks a point of spiritual achievement and etherical completion, the priest and the prosecutor together in an understanding, conflicted with the god of war. This was indeed to be a time of imbalance, dissolution, extremism, and provocation. The man that would make himself go down in history, not just for how he died, but how he lived. In less than 7 hours of these glorious yet terrifying astralisms, David Koresh, who was busy writing his revelation of the 7th angel's message, a Leo sun Solera with a Libran ascendant and Aries counter, would soon be accused of fulfilling his own prophecy. His densely aspected 3rd house Saturn was isolated in Sagittarius in his native chart. However, on the day he died, Saturn was combust in his moon sign of Aquarius on the 12th house, as well as Mars in detriment on the 4th house, his native sign on the midheaven. According to the policies of the planets and their order, on this day, this man was a walking contradiction, and soon he would die at age 33. In like the lion, out like the lamb. Sol Invictus traveled across the ecliptic for 731 days before he arrived back to a familiar place. However, this time, Pluto was planning a surprise with a non-negotiable approach to Jupiter in its domicile retrograde. Saturn and Venus were in a conjunction together in the 11th house on Pisces. The higher octave of Mars was freshly wearing a new mask, and in Sagittarius, he perfectly fit the appearance of the brand new face of terror. While Mars was trined in the 4th house to Jupiter and the Moon in the 7th, the South Node was conjunct Mercury on Taurus in the 12th house. On April 19, 1995, at 9:02 a.m., the very moment that the Murrah building imploded, Timothy James McVeigh had either willingly or unwillingly changed the course of his life forever. At that very moment, his native ascendant of Gemini was rising in the east, while its ruler, Mercury, was hanging out with his Taurian sun, and his Venus and Saturn were in his native 11th house in the sign of Aries. It was at this very moment that a 26-year-old Taurus sun with his Venus and Saturn conjunct his North Node on his 11th house in Aries, and a grand cross between his Moon, Mercury, Pluto, Uranus, and Mars ran through alleyways in downtown Oklahoma City after having just felt the explosive impact of the destructive weapon he had only moments before left in a specific location with the full intention of doing damage in more ways than one. Despite which version of the story you believe, that being whether or not McVeigh primarily worked alone or if he was behaving on the orders of a third party, there is one thing that cannot be disputed about the Oklahoma City bombing, and it's Waco. It's David Koresh. Therefore, there so happens to be answers to both of the mysteries of Koresh and McVeigh hidden within the grandest transformational periods in both of their lives astrologically. And this encompasses both of the natal charts of their deaths. Although Koresh died the same day his life changed, McVeigh had a 6-year window in between the day that changed his life and the day that saw his life to an end. Like the day that Koresh died, down to the very minute that McVeigh was executed at 7:14 a.m. on June 11th, 2001, there was a 4-planet stellium in the 12th house on his ascendant, as well as the ascendant sign of his crime, Gemini. The stellium consisted of the company of Saturn, Sun, Jupiter, and Mercury. The North Node was on the ascendant in Cancer, the same sign that gave detriment to Mars the very minute that the FBI brought combat vehicles onto the Mount Carmel property. The relationship between Leo and Taurus is not just astrotheologically understood through archetypal assignments, but through the electromagnetic essence of all scriptures, that being the holy cross of fixed points in the heavens that have their integrity accentuated in the books of Ezekiel and Revelation as the 4 corners of heaven, which in addition to ecclesiastical significance, these quadrants have been depicted for centuries on the tarot cards of the world and the Wheel of Fortune. Fixed earth and fixed fire, off the top of my head, can be best described as Blossom and Buttercup from the Powerpuff Girls. Without getting too caught up in the irrelevant contrast between fictional animations to real-life people, in their natural state, the elements already create the dynamic of what chemists call an insoluble substance. However, when analyzing the interconnection between the fixed elements, fixed fire and earth in particular, they are evidently immiscible. Koresh and McVeigh, however, despite never having met each other, were within the close vicinity of each other, it is believed, on more than one occasion, as well as speculation that they shared mutual acquaintances through the gun show circuit. Social correspondences aside, the significance of April 19th falling on days that were ultimately consequential for both Koresh and McVeigh goes much deeper than most would expect, as April 19th is the first day of the 13-day celebration known as the blood sacrifice to the beast. As described in my sophomore video titled The Legacy of April 19th Lives On Through the Elite, in Freemasonic tradition, their most highly anticipated celebration is Beltane Day, otherwise known as May Day, which falls on May 1st, the same day that the 13-day blood sacrifice to the beast ends. The celebration is said to have ancient connections to the Canaanite Phoenician deity known as Baal, the demiurgal deity said to favor child sacrifice, hence the awful deaths of close to 50 children during Waco and Oklahoma City combined. As stated before, David Koresh was a clergyman, an unconventional one at that, but far from being a heretic, David Koresh had single-handedly amassed a large following of like-minded seekers of biblical truth. Without going into detail, at some point during Koresh's theologian position, prior to the federal government's pursuit of him, he began to teach the Babylon they had already anticipated the arrival of was coming to face the residents of Mount Carmel in 1995 under the same exact circumstances that transpired 2 years earlier than what he had predicted. Why is this relevant? Because 1995 was the year that the facade of a disgruntled all-American soldier would carry out his attack that, according to multiple sources, including his legal representatives, was in part revenge on the United States government for what they, Babylon, did to the man who viewed himself as the sixth angel of God's message. Regardless of what you think of McVeigh or Koresh, or what you have heard of them, it is very important that you understand that trying to make sense of the relationship between Waco in Oklahoma and Koresh and McVeigh is essentially useless and undignified until astrology and its ecliptic science is added into the question. Once this happens, the observer will begin to notice that the Piscean age was rife with Plutonian, Venusian, and Martial significations that indeed express themselves through the guise of both events and both hosts of the events, offering not so much the dangers of the past, but warning for our future.